What if I told you that the ultimate royal fairy tale didn't just crumble behind closed doors, but was systematically dismantled in a single, devastating night? Absolutely frozen out. No warning, no gradual fading of affection, just a sudden, brutal chill that has left Queen Camilla virtually a ghost within the very palace she fought for decades to rule. Welcome back to Crown Watch, and if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, do it right now because the royal bombshell we are deconstructing today is so massive, it's currently shaking the very foundations of Buckingham Palace. We're talking about a secret, highly classified dossier compiled not by MI6, not by the media, but personally hand-delivered by Prince William himself under the cover of darkness. A report so damning, so meticulously documented with airtight evidence of personal power grabs, financial irregularities, and deep-seated palace manipulation that King Charles was left completely stunned. Literally overnight, the king made a choice that changed everything, executing a silent, clinical coup against his own wife. How does a decades-long love story turn into a cold, calculated eviction in the span of a few hours? What was in those sealed, wax-stamped pages that made Charles completely shift his loyalty? Pour yourselves a drink, hit subscribe, and get comfortable, because we are stripping away the royal PR paint and diving headfirst into the shocking, unvarnished truth of the report that changed the British monarchy forever. The sheer gravity of what transpired on that fateful night cannot be overstated. To understand how we arrived at this chilling standstill, we have to look closely at the players involved and the heavy, historically charged baggage they carry into this modern-day palace coup. Prince William has never been a passive bystander in the turbulent history of his family, and his relationship with Camilla has always been, at best, a polite diplomatic truce. For years, the public was fed a carefully curated narrative of a blended, harmonious family, but behind the heavy oak doors of Kensington Palace, William was watching. He was observing a silent, creeping expansion of influence that seemed to bypass every established rule of the British monarchy. This wasn't just a stepmother trying to find her footing. According to those inside the circle, this was a systematic, calculated infiltration designed to establish an independent hub of power. William, possessing the sharp, protective instincts of a future king who has witnessed the devastating consequences of palace intrigue firsthand, began noticing subtle but alarming shifts in how the household was being run. The turning point came when long-serving staff members, people who had dedicated their entire adult lives to the service of the crown and who had been fierce loyalists to Queen Elizabeth II, began quietly vanishing from their posts. These weren't junior aides or temporary interns. We are talking about senior operational managers, keepers of the royal protocol, and financial watchdogs who suddenly found themselves pushed to the margins or abruptly seeking early retirement. William didn't just find this suspicious. He recognized it as an institutional threat. He began quietly gathering data, conducting discreet conversations with displaced staff, and cross-referencing administrative anomalies. He realized that under the guise of modernizing the monarchy, an entirely separate power structure was being erected right under his father's nose, fueled by personal loyalty to Camilla rather than to the reigning monarch or the institution itself. The tension had been building for months, a quiet, suffocating pressure within the palace corridors that everyone felt but no one dared to speak aloud to the king, who was already dealing with the immense weight of his reign and his ongoing health battles. William knew that presenting mere rumors or family grievances would achieve nothing but alienate his father, so he treated the situation not as a family dispute, but as a high-level corporate and constitutional investigation. He compiled a dossier so dense, so rigorously documented, that it left no room for deniability. Every single claim, from the forced transfers of beloved staff members to the irregular reallocation of office budgets, was backed by dates, names, security logs, and financial ledger numbers. This was a document designed to survive the most intense scrutiny, because William knew that the moment he handed it over, he was putting his own relationship with his father on the line. When that manila envelope, sealed with William's private wax stamp, was delivered to King Charles at 9:30 p.m., it wasn't just a delivery, it was a detonation. The king, sitting alone in his private study after dismissing his staff, opened the seal expecting perhaps a routine update or a personal letter from his heir, only to be confronted with a systematic autopsy of his own household's integrity. As Charles read through the first few pages, the initial shock quickly gave way to a profound, sickening realization. The report detailed how Camilla had actively worked to isolate him, subtly filtering the information that reached his desk and replacing seasoned, objective advisors with her own hand-picked circle of loyalists. The very woman he had fought a lifetime to put beside him on the throne was now being exposed as the architect of a quiet, internal takeover. The report meticulously laid out the pattern of behavior, starting with the quiet eviction of a household manager who had served the family for over 20 years. This manager had raised questions about Camilla's increasingly independent operations and, within days, found themselves subjected to a hostile, private interrogation by the Queen Consort herself, who bluntly demanded to know where their true loyalties lay. The manager was left so deeply shaken by the encounter that they requested an immediate transfer to a minor, remote administrative role, a move that sent shockwaves through the lower ranks of the palace staff. William's report didn't just stop at one isolated incident. It documented 2 more identical cases of veteran staff being systematically undermined and replaced by individuals brought in from outside the traditional, rigorous palace recruitment channels. These new appointees had no background in royal service, but possessed one vital qualification: absolute, unquestioning devotion to Camilla. With these chess pieces in place, the information flow within the palace began to warp. Decisions that had historically required the consensus of the king's senior advisors were suddenly being finalized in informal, private meetings held in Camilla's personal apartments, specifically scheduled during times when Charles was occupied with demanding state duties or resting. The report even included security log timestamps showing exactly when these private meetings took place and who attended them, drawing a terrifyingly clear picture of a parallel court operating in the shadows of the real one. Charles read on, his eyes scanning the detailed accounts of financial irregularities that, while perhaps not monumental in the grand scheme of state budgets, represented a blatant and alarming disregard for the strict fiscal standards of the modern monarchy. Funds allocated for the Queen Consort's office had been quietly increased and diverted to projects and external consultants without passing through the standard, independent audit committees. When palace financial officers tried to raise red flags, they were met with vague, dismissive responses from Camilla's new staff, who subtly hinted that questioning these expenditures was equivalent to questioning the Queen's personal authority. It was a classic power play, using the king's name and status as a shield to bypass the very rules that keep the monarchy accountable to the public. But perhaps the most devastating section of the report for Charles was the evidence showing how his own communications were being manipulated. The dossier proved that Camilla's inner circle had begun intercepting and summarizing critical briefings before they ever reached his desk, effectively controlling what he saw, what he heard, and ultimately, what he decided. She had framed this to him in the past as a loving, protective gesture to spare him from unnecessary stress and fatigue, but looking at the hard evidence compiled by William, Charles could finally see it for what it truly was: a sophisticated operation of information control designed to keep him isolated, dependent, and fundamentally out of the loop. The king sat there as the clock struck midnight, the quiet of the study feeling heavier than it ever had before, staring at the pages that shattered the domestic peace he had spent decades trying to secure. He was forced to confront the painful truth that his trusting nature and his desire for a smooth, harmonious partnership had been weaponized against him, creating a dangerous vacuum where personal ambition had replaced institutional duty. And as he closed the folder and locked it securely in his desk drawer, he knew that the soft, accommodating husband of yesterday had to die so that the king could survive. The next morning, the palace woke up to a completely different reality, though only a handful of people knew why the atmosphere had suddenly turned sub-zero. When Charles entered the private breakfast room, the warm, familiar routine that had defined his mornings with Camilla for years was instantly and brutally severed. There was no affectionate greeting, no shared laughter over the morning papers, and no comfortable conversation about the day's upcoming engagements. Charles sat at the far end of the table, his posture rigid and his eyes firmly fixed on his official red boxes, offering nothing more than a cold, formal nod in response to her presence. Camilla, accustomed to being his primary confidant and partner in all things, tried to initiate light, casual conversation to break the sudden, thick tension, but her attempts were met with monosyllabic, icy responses that made it clear the subject was closed before it even began. He finished his tea in silence and left the room without a single backward glance, leaving her sitting alone with a growing, cold dread in her chest, entirely unaware that the manila envelope locked in his study had already sealed the fate of her standing in the royal household. Within hours of that breakfast, the administrative machinery of the palace began to shift gears with terrifying efficiency as Charles quietly but decisively acted on the evidence William had laid bare. The king bypassed the usual channels and directly instructed his private secretary to implement a series of radical, unprecedented changes to the daily operations of the household. The first major blow came with the restructuring of transport and logistics, a subtle but highly visible public signal of separation. Charles ordered that all future travel arrangements for official engagements be split, dictating that he and Camilla would no longer travel in the same vehicle, even when attending the exact same event. When Camilla's office was informed that her car would be departing 15 minutes after the king's, her staff tried to raise objections, citing scheduling efficiency and public perception, but they were flatly told that the directive came directly from the king himself and was not open to discussion. This was just the beginning of the relocation of the king's personal quarters was a logistical nightmare for the palace staff, but Charles had made it clear that this move was non-negotiable. By establishing his residence in a completely separate wing of the palace, an area historically reserved for visiting foreign dignitaries and high-ranking guests, he created a physical barrier that Camilla could not easily cross. The shared private apartments, which had once been the warm, beating heart of their relationship, were suddenly quiet and empty on his side. This physical distance was accompanied by an immediate and absolute block on her informal access to him. The days of Camilla walking casually into his study to chat, offer advice, or subtly steer a conversation were over. If she wanted to see her husband, she now had to go through his formal appointments diary, a process managed by a private secretary who had been briefed to prioritize state business and Prince William's schedule over the Queen Consort's requests. This sudden isolation sent shockwaves through Camilla's newly established inner circle. The staff she had recruited from outside the traditional palace channels, the ones who had bypassed the rigorous vetting processes to secure positions of trust, suddenly found themselves operating in a vacuum. They were still in the palace, and they still held their titles, but the pipeline of information had been completely cut off. When they tried to access the king's daily briefing papers, they were politely but firmly told that the distribution lists had been updated on royal authority. When they attempted to submit schedule suggestions or policy recommendations, their documents were returned with formal, dry cover notes stating that the king's agenda was fully committed. The parallel network of power that Camilla had spent months building was effectively starved of its oxygen, access to the monarch. Camilla's frustration quickly turned into a quiet, desperate panic as she realized the extent of her displacement. She began to notice that the household staff, even those who had previously shown her the utmost deference, were changing their behavior. The small, daily interactions that signal one's true standing in a royal household began to dry up. Servants who would once wait for her instructions before clearing a room now looked past her, directing their gaze and their queries solely to the king's personal aides. The polite, deferential chatter that usually followed her through the corridors was replaced by a heavy, professional silence. It became clear to everyone in the palace hierarchy that the wind had shifted, and nobody wanted to be caught standing on the wrong side of the king's favor. Desperate to find a way out of this freezing fog, Camilla attempted to bypass the formal barriers by organizing a private, intimate dinner. She knew that if she could just get Charles alone, away from the prying eyes of advisors and the rigid structure of the palace day, she could use her decades of shared history to melt the ice. She sent a personal, handwritten note through a trusted page, suggesting a quiet evening in her apartments with a menu of his favorite dishes. The response did not come back in her husband's familiar handwriting. Instead, 2 days later, she received a typed memorandum from the king's private secretary. The note formally declined the invitation, citing the king's demanding preparation schedule for upcoming state visits and his need for uninterrupted evening rest. The clinical, institutional tone of the refusal was a devastating confirmation that Charles was no longer willing to be alone with her. As the days crawled by, the exclusion grew more public and far more humiliating. The planning sessions for the upcoming autumn royal tours were scheduled to take place in the king's private library. Historically, Camilla had always sat beside Charles during these meetings, offering her input on public relations, dress codes, and local charities. When she arrived at the library door for the first major planning session, she was stopped by the usher on duty. With a red face and a stammering voice, the staff member informed her that the seating plan had been adjusted and that her presence was not required for this phase of the planning. Looking past the usher's shoulder, Camilla could see Prince William seated at the long mahogany table, a thick binder of documents open before him, deep in conversation with his father. The door was quietly but firmly closed in her face. This was not just a private snub, it was a structural realignment of the monarchy's leadership. With Camilla excluded, William was stepping directly into the vacuum. The Prince of Wales was no longer just the heir waiting in the wings. He was actively partnering with the king to run the institution. The two men were seen together constantly, walking the palace grounds, holding late-night consultations, and traveling to state functions in the same car. The visual contrast was stark. While the king and his heir presented a united, powerful front of continuity and strength, the queen consort was left to travel alone, arriving at joint engagements in a separate vehicle, smiling bravely for the cameras while harboring a deep, consuming dread about what was happening behind the scenes. The reorganization quickly spread to Camilla's public-facing roles and charitable endeavors. Charles began a systematic review of all joint patronages and foundation boards they shared. Without consulting her, his office issued a series of administrative directives that effectively removed her name from the leadership of several high-profile initiatives. In some cases, her responsibilities were quietly reassigned to other members of the royal family, including the Duchess of Edinburgh and Prince William himself. The official justification presented to the media was organizational restructuring to optimize royal duties, but within the palace, the message was loud and clear. The queen consort's wings were being systematically clipped, her public platform reduced to a purely ceremonial, decorative role. Camilla's attempts to rally support from her social circle were met with a chilling silence. The wealthy, influential friends who had previously clamored for invitations to her private gatherings suddenly became incredibly difficult to reach. When she or her staff reached out to arrange weekend stays or private lunches, they were met with a wall of polite excuses, prior commitments, family obligations, or sudden travel plans. Charles had not made any grand, public denunciation of his wife, but he had let it be known through his closest confidants that he preferred his friends to maintain a respectful distance from the queen consort for the time being. In the high society world of the British aristocracy, a subtle hint from the monarch is more powerful than a formal decree. Within weeks, Camilla found her social calendar virtually wiped clean, leaving her more isolated than she had been in decades. In a state of growing desperation, Camilla decided to put her concerns in writing. She knew that verbal appeals were being blocked, so she sat down and wrote a long, emotional letter to Charles. She didn't address the specific allegations of the report, partly because she still didn't know the full extent of what William had uncovered, but instead focused on the sudden, inexplicable distance between them. She wrote about their long history, the battles they had fought together to be accepted by the public, and the deep pain his current coldness was causing her. She begged him for a face-to-face meeting, even if only for 15 minutes, to clear the air and resolve whatever misunderstanding had come between them. She sealed the letter herself and gave it to her most loyal remaining aide with strict instructions to deliver it directly to the king's personal valet. The reply that came back 2 days later was the final, crushing blow to any hope of a quick reconciliation. It was a single, typed paragraph on official Buckingham Palace stationery and signed by the king, but written on his direct instruction by his chief advisor. The letter stated that the king was fully aware of all the circumstances regarding the administration of the household, and that any future communications regarding operational matters, staffing, or personal arrangements should be directed through the formal offices of their respective private secretaries. The letter concluded with a cold, devastating line. His Majesty wishes to maintain a professional and orderly household, and trusts that all members of the family will respect the established boundaries of their roles. The realization that her husband was now communicating with her through the same formal, bureaucratic channels he would use for a foreign diplomat or a government official left Camilla paralyzed with fear. She was living in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury, and holding the grandest title a woman in Britain could possess, but she had never been more utterly powerless. The network she had tried so hard to build had vanished, her allies had been sidelined or transferred, and her husband had retreated behind a wall of cold, unyielding protocol. As she sat alone in her quiet apartments, watching the rain beat against the high windows of the palace, she finally began to comprehend the sheer scale of the trap she had walked into, a trap sprung not by an enemy in the media, but by the quiet, meticulous Prince of Wales, who was now standing firmly beside the king, watching her empire turn to ash. The cold administrative wall that Charles built around Camilla was not just a temporary defensive measure, it was a permanent, structural fortress that reshaped the entire daily life of the royal court. In the weeks that followed, the silent war of attrition moved from behind closed doors into the very corridors of power where the business of the British state was conducted. The King's Advisory Council, now firmly under the joint influence of Charles and William, embarked on a thorough audit of the palace's financial and administrative machinery. Every single transaction, every minor staff appointment, and every policy directive issued by the Queen Consort's office over the past 2 years was subjected to a rigorous, painful review. This was not a quiet audit. Although the public was kept completely in the dark, the atmosphere within the palace offices was akin to an active investigation. The financial team, backed by external auditors who had been discreetly brought in under strict non-disclosure agreements, worked late into the night. They uncovered a paper trail of micro-allocations that had been used to fund Camilla's independent public relations campaigns, efforts designed to subtly elevate her image at the expense of other, more senior royals. The funds, while legally within the broader palace budget, had been moved through complex internal accounts to avoid the standard, independent oversight of the Treasury. When the final audit report was completed, Charles signed off on a series of sweeping financial reforms that stripped the Queen Consort's office of any independent budgetary authority. From that moment on, every single penny spent by her staff had to be personally approved by the King's chief financial officer. The human cost of this administrative purge was felt immediately by Camilla's remaining allies. The ambitious, loyal staff members she had carefully positioned in key administrative roles were systematically dismantled. They were not fired, which would have triggered unwanted questions from the media and labor unions, but were instead reassigned to mundane, low-profile duties. The communications director she had personally selected was moved to a quiet role managing the royal archives at Windsor, far away from the daily decision-making processes. The logistical advisors who had helped coordinate her private meetings were transferred to regional administrative offices. Within a matter of weeks, the vibrant, ambitious team that had once surrounded the Queen Consort was reduced to a skeleton crew of low-level secretaries who had no access to power and no influence over palace operations. Camilla's isolation was now total. She found herself living in a silent world where her only interactions were with servants who treated her with an icy, clinical professionalism. The warmth, the small talk, and the shared jokes that make palace life bearable had completely evaporated. When she walked through the state apartments, she was met with polite, downcast eyes and quick, hushed steps as staff members sought to avoid her path. She knew that any conversation she attempted would be noted, analyzed, and ultimately reported back to the king's office. She had become a liability, a figure of fallen favor whom nobody wanted to be associated with. The psychological weight of this silent exile began to take a visible toll on her health. The brave, smiling facade she maintained for the public during her occasional ceremonial duties began to slip behind closed doors. She suffered from persistent, stress-induced headaches that left her confined to her darkened bedroom for days at a time. Her appetite dwindled, and she became increasingly frail, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame. The sleepless nights she spent pacing the floors of her private apartments were filled with a desperate, circular search for answers. She replayed the events of the past few years over and over in her mind, trying to understand how a strategy she believed was so subtle and secure had been so completely exposed and dismantled. She realized, with a creeping sense of horror, that she had fundamentally underestimated Prince William. She had always viewed him as a somewhat distant, emotional figure who was too consumed by his own personal struggles to pay close attention to the intricate machinery of the palace. She now saw that his quiet, observant nature was not a sign of disinterest, but of a patient, calculating intellect. He had waited, watched, and gathered his evidence with the cold precision of a chess master, choosing the exact moment when his father was most vulnerable and most in need of loyal support to strike his decisive blow. By presenting the report as an institutional defense of the crown rather than a personal attack on his stepmother, William had left Charles with no choice but to act. In her desperation, Camilla made one final, high-stakes attempt to break the deadlock. She instructed her personal secretary to arrange an urgent, private meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, hoping that the spiritual leader of the Church of England, and the man who had anointed her alongside the king, could act as a mediator. She believed that the Church's traditional emphasis on reconciliation and family unity could be used to pressure Charles into a compromise. The Archbishop, sensing the immense constitutional danger of the situation, agreed to a private discussion at Lambeth Palace, away from the prying eyes of the royal household. The meeting, however, did not yield the results Camilla had so desperately hoped for. The Archbishop listened to her emotional appeals with quiet, pastoral sympathy, but made it clear that he could not interfere in the internal, constitutional administration of the royal household. He gently reminded her of the solemn vows she had taken to serve the institution of the crown, and suggested that her current, quiet retirement from active decision-making might be the most dignified and supportive path she could take for the sake of the king's health and the stability of the monarchy. It was a polite, holy refusal that left her with no doubt that even the highest institutions of the state were aligned with the king and the Prince of Wales. As the summer progressed, the public-facing reality of the royal family became a carefully choreographed play. The king and queen consort continued to appear together at major state events, but the dynamic between them had been stripped of any genuine human connection. They stood side by side on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, they rode in the gold state coach, and they hosted foreign heads of state, but they were two strangers playing a part. The quick, reassuring glances, the shared smiles, and the gentle touch on the arm that had once characterized their public partnership were gone. In their place was a rigid, professional choreography that protected the image of the monarchy while masking a devastating personal void. The real power now resided in the newly consolidated partnership between King Charles and Prince William. The Prince of Wales was no longer just the heir, he was the co-ruler in all but name. He attended every major policy meeting, sat in on the king's audiences with the prime minister, and played a leading role in the modernization of the royal estates. The message to the public and the political establishment was clear. The succession was secure, the leadership was unified, and the future of the House of Windsor was being built on a foundation of absolute transparency, institutional integrity, and shared duty. Camilla was left to contemplate a future of permanent, gilded isolation. She had achieved her lifetime ambition of becoming queen consort, but the crown she wore had been stripped of all its real gold, leaving her with nothing but a heavy, hollow symbol of a power she could no longer wield. As she sat in her quiet wing of the palace, listening to the distant, rhythmic footsteps of the guards outside her window, she had to accept the final, bitter truth. She had lost the Game of Thrones, not to a grand public scandal or a political revolution, but to the quiet, devastating power of a father and son who had united to protect their legacy at any cost. And that brings us to the ultimate, chilling climax of this unprecedented palace shutdown. The queen consort, once the most influential voice in King Charles's ear, now stands completely stripped of her authority, a silent spectator in a monarchy that has moved on without her. Prince William's masterstroke didn't just protect his father, it permanently secured the future of the House of Windsor, proving that when the survival of the crown is on the line, even the deepest personal bonds will be clinically severed. But now, the real question is, what do you think? Did Prince William do the right thing by presenting this explosive dossier to save his father's legacy? Or was this a cold, calculated move to eliminate Camilla's influence once and for all? How long can the royal family maintain this fragile, manufactured public facade before the crushing reality of this Cold War finally leaks to the global press? We want to hear your theories on this incredible story. Scroll down right now and drop your thoughts in the comments section below. Let's get a massive debate going. If you found this deep dive into the palace's dark administrative corridors absolutely gripping, make sure to slam that like button. Share this video with every royal enthusiast you know, and most importantly, hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. You do not want to miss our next exclusive update on Crown Watch as we continue to track every single shift in this high-stakes royal standoff. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.